on your books, you emphasize the collective unconscious dimension, the system of totality, whole in whole, as mentioned by Jung with regards to unus mundus. Or we could quote as well the idea of pleroma and Corbin's active imagination. So you talk about Yahweh as the sacred side towards the human being, an angry, negative, destructive side, in other words, a devouring eye that destroys with an excess of fire, we can also say masculine, the mind of the human being, in particular in border structure. Border should be the type of individual that suffers an unsatisfactory relationship or too confused between the personal unconscious and the collective one. It lacks a sacred eye, religious and positive thought, which the border may clear and heal the self-division between fusion and distance. Moreover, you also add the great difficulty belonging to the border to relate with the implied order, I think about David Bohm, through which the artificial dimension of the psyche is activated. So, we would like to ask your opinion, vision, and perception of the globalization nowadays. Which are the conditions that, in this current framework, could foster and cure the borders experience?
The borderline personality is a designation that came into being just the end of the 1940s and then 1950s and 60s. And before the borderline came into being, most of psychoanalysis was oriented towards models of like hysteria and repression. Borderline ushered in a whole new way of thinking, and it required that people really think not in terms of repression, but in terms of much more primitive dynamics that in psychoanalysis we call splitting, we call projective identification. These are dynamics in which reality is modified, not totally distorted, but changed, unlike in neurosis. And the borderline person, when they finally started to get enough clinicians looking, there's sort of a list of features that could define what one meets now in the borderline person. So you meet somebody who has very unstable emotional relations, somebody who has a very hard time staying connected to somebody in a way that's solidly this or that. Instead, there's a wavering a lot between good and bad. You have a person who, the same person will tend to use idealization of people in a very defensive way. And they suffer terribly from a feature that Kernberg emphasizes a lot, is a sense of identity diffusion. Who am I? You know, the borderline personality can say, I'm myself when I'm my sister. You know, the sense of self and the object intertwine and can be very chaotic for the person and create a very chaotic world so that their sense of self is very interfused with the object. The person suffers equally, we find, from a rather strong psychotic part. That means a part that can seriously emotionally flood the person, distort reality, often in very paranoid ways. The person also suffers terribly from a sense of emptiness and deadness. A borderline person will frequently create a lot of chaos in order to feel alive. Like a woman said to me once, I'm either a 0 or a 10. I do everything to create a sense of inner life. The borderline person also suffers terribly from the threat of abandonment. And so in every situation, in every relationship, there's a lot of a tendency to spend a lot of time, worrying about abandonment and what to do to not be abandoned. So features like that, along, and an important one to add to is the chronic use of what we call in psychology of projective identification. And that means that the person's imagination manages to induce reactions in the other person that are not necessarily the other person's. And those reactions live in the other person while the, say, patient or subject sort of watches it with like a paranoid eye to see what the person is doing with it. So if you're the target of projective identification, it, in a strong way, can be very confusing to have a sense of what's me and what's the person. So once one began to get a sense of the fact that this existed, this difficult quality existed, along with the fact that the person will frequently self-mutilate, will be often suicidal, at least at times, will have eating disorders, have very, very strong bouts of rage that are uncontained. So there's a lot of very, very difficult features that you meet clinically. Now, that's why so many books are written about the borderline personality. You see, people were trying to understand what to do. Now, in America, in a certain way, the borderline personality has been part of the defeat of psychoanalysis. There is very little, aside from Kernberg, who has done, heroic work in trying to understand the borderline from a point of view of developmental theory, of the way the internal objects are formed, and the way they project, and the way they introject, and this whole way of looking at parts of the person. Nobody has done that like Kernberg for decades. But very few people follow that anymore because it's too difficult. The model is extremely difficult to use, but the reason the model is valuable. Mm-hmm. But you see, what you find in dealing with the borderline personality is the cardinal issue that in spite of all these symptoms, you can have these and know this, but what happens when that person comes in the room is the field, I call it, or the transference, countertransference relation. The effect of the patient's psyche and the analyst get together. The patient's psyche and the analyst's psyche join, and they join in extremely complicated ways which are very, very hard to distinguish and deal with. Furthermore, unlike dealing with other patients, this kind of transference, countertransference, can appear in the first session. So one's in a situation of having to deal with a very complex interaction with the person, filled with all kinds of feelings and emotions that make it very difficult for the analyst to think. The analyst is filled with what Bion called beta products, meaning pieces of like shards of thought or feeling or emotion, but that don't form a complete thought. But more than anything, the borderline personality poses an extreme difficulty for the therapist, because the therapist's sense of self is made very unstable. Now, whatever way you think about the self, either a Jungian way, which thinks about it as a archetypal center that has an ordering capacity, or you think about it as a Freudian psychoanalytic way, as a content of the ego, it is the core of identity. So what happens in dealing with the borderline person is there's this flood of emotions, feelings, a mixture of who am I, and a very difficult job of getting a sense of keeping one's identity. So in a sense, the borderline is in a border range between neurotic and psychotic, but it isn't just, it isn't a mixture, it's a thing in itself. And it's in that realm that the analyst is thrust with the borderline patient and has to do a tremendous amount of work of containing, metabolizing, reflecting on responses in order to help the person get to a point where they can begin to own their strength and have some resurrection of this internal self they have, which has been killed in a way by powerfully negative affects. So, what happens in treatment is, from my point of view, put it this way, from my point of view, the object relations method that Kernberg would talk about and do so well, to me is not sufficient to the task. What we're dealing with in dealing with the borderline is really a need to find a container which is an in-between field with the person, and it's the kind of language and containment that once came from alchemy. Now, in that world, the basic unit is relations, is not you and the person, but what's the nature of the field of relations between you. That quality of relations, not objects and me, objects and you, but the quality of relations is the basic unit of what you refer to as the implicate order, Bohm's implicate order, the order of oneness rather than parts. So by looking at the field with the patient, one really gets a sense of the oneness. One is dealing through oneness more than just parts. Now, I probably should tell you some clinical material to show you what I'm talking about. But there's one thing I want to stress. Jung, in his alchemical researches, said that the prima materia, the materia out of which the self, a new self, is to be born. Not a mental, spiritual self alone, but a self that has a body. A self that has a body, a self that includes order and disorder. Very different. Now, from what we have in the collective or have had for several thousand years. This self-structure is trying to emerge. Jung said it emerges out of what he called the prima materia, and he said the prima materia is the Attis Kibble myth. That's a powerful statement. He localizes it in this terms of this myth. And let me tell you the nature of this myth, because it is the core problem of the borderline. And in fact, it's the core issue in all the character disorders, in the whole array of entities that came to be studied after the repression model of Freud that he tried to use no longer worked. So it's the narcissistic character disorders, the schizoid disorders. These fundamental character disorders all have this fundamental Attis-Kibble myth. Believe it, you can see how widely different this is from Kernberg's approach. They have this Attis-Kibble myth at its core. Now, what is this myth? This myth, which came to be at around 200 BC in Rome, was brought into Rome, in fact, from Anatolia. And the story is as follows. The story is there is the great goddess Kibble. She is the goddess, the great mother goddess, the goddess of animals, the whole goddess of the world. She is a mountain goddess. She is a great power. And Kibble has a consort called Attis. Now, this consort Attis, at some point, sees a woman he falls in love with, a river nymph called Sagaritas. And he loves her and goes towards her. Kibble sees what happens, and she kills the nymph. Attis is incredibly upset that he has, not that the nymph has died, but that he has betrayed Kibble by separating from her. And in his despair, he runs to the top of this Mount Dindymus, which is Kibble also, and castrates himself and goes mad. And that story of madness, self-castration, is a deep core part of what goes on in the borderline disorder, but especially the fact that the person is caught in a web of feelings in which he cannot separate from whatever object he is with, nor can he stay with it. He's in an impossible in-between world where separation feels absolutely catastrophic, like the total bottom falls out, life's over. But at the same time, staying with this object, whatever it may be, say a person, say a theory, say a political system, staying with it feels suffocating. And the person is caught in a way that is neither with an object nor away from the object. He can neither stay nor can he leave. Now, if the person happens to be in a safe territory that's well known, this whole realm won't come up. It's when, a person in general, it's when the person begins to separate and do something new that it comes up. But for the borderline person, it's chronic. It's always there. Andre Green spoke about this neither nor logic. And it's very important to understand that this is a domain in its own right, and it's very disturbing because when you're dealing with the borderline personality, very commonly you can neither say something nor not say something. And in that process, you have to tolerate states of mindlessness, states where there's a gap between anything you think and feel. A gap is a term Winnicott used in his latest writings. And the idea is to be able to learn to tolerate that and be able to deal with it so that eventually some thought, emotion, image will arise. That's not easy. People have a terrible time doing that. For one thing, they have a terrible time realizing that when these terrible energy fields go on, that it's actually a very primitive form of union. That actually is a form of union with the patient. It's only generally thought of as a horror story to get away from. But it's actually a form of union. It's what Jung calls a grotesque form of the conjunctio. He shows a picture in Mysterium Conjunctionis from the very ancient alchemical text called the Turba Philosophorum of a dragon entwined in a woman in a cave. and it's hard to make out what the hell's going on. The conjunctio in the borderline is very grotesque and primitive, but the important thing to realize is it is a union, and it will be followed by a dark negredo, a state of madness, chaos, disorientation, mental disorientation especially. So what I'm trying to make the point is when you have an alchemical model, you have a way of thinking about these terrible states that you don't have from a model that's developmental or object relations. And because you have that, you then furthermore can think about some container for these states. And that container is, in a strange way, an in-between world between you and the client. It's a world of imagination. It's a world that's close to the unus mundus. And the idea is to be able to get one's attention on that world and be able to recover one's imagination. But you see, what the borderline pushes us into is a realm of experience that's completely beyond what's fathomable from a Cartesian position of subject-object world, of mind-body differentiation. The borderline, what we need in dealing with the borderline is a set of ways of thinking and feeling and imagining that implicitly accept the intertwining of subject and object, of mind and body, and of the acts of fundamental faith of order emerging out of that. Now that intertwining is what the philosopher Merleau-Ponty called the flesh. And he talked about the chiasm of the flesh, meaning the intertwining. Flesh is like what in alchemy is the subtle body. But you see, while we have on the horizon through philosophy of people like Merleau-Ponty, Levinas, Derrida, you got these wonderful attitudes that take us beyond the subject-object duality that ruled science for so long and that rules psychology in terms of object relations and developmental theories and all. We go beyond that into ways of thinking in which phenomenology just look into this. The phenomena we have is enough to get some new order to come up, and in which we tolerate this intertwining with another person. The point is that in all of these approaches, they're complicated. Their new words come up. It's hard for philosophers to even know what Merleau-Ponty meant by the flesh. It's not that it's easy, it's hard, but what it all leaves out is the dark side. And the dark side is what the borderline brings us. The borderline brings us the dark side of the emergence of a new consciousness that people like Merleau-Ponty and others have tried to bring forth, where they make perception rooted in the body and not in the mind primarily. So the borderline is a very big philosophical issue. In a sense, nothing fundamentally new ever incarnates, ever comes into a space-time reality without a dark side, without a chaotic side. In the ancient religion of Zoroastrianism, there was principle of light and principle of dark. Ahriman, the devil, disorder, and Ormazd, order. And they battled. But one of the great insights in Zoroastrianism was that this chaotic, demonic side is necessary for the potential, the values of order, or Ormazd, to become actual. We don't actualize in time, space, life without the dark side. A person without the shadow doesn't actualize anything like an inner center. Instead, he's a machine taking on collective values. So what you have with the times we live in is the emergence of a new God image trying to occur, an image of the self, an image that requires related to through fields, through relationship with others, not solitary alone. And it's a whole new self-image that has a very dark, chaotic side, which we see in the borderline personality, especially in this level of this intertwining where it's impossible to separate and impossible to stay, and the enormous chaotic energies that come up to try to break that fusion. I believe the cutting, the self-destruction, the unbearable rages, all of this is part of, the terrible things the borderline will do to both feel alive and break the grip of this impossible fusional state. So Jung really struck gold where he said that the prima materia of alchemy is the Attis Kybele myth, and to that he added the alchemical god Mercurius. And it's in this god Mercurius, who's this alchemical creation where opposites fly apart, where the god's a trickster, where the god is both God and the devil. The god is a tremendous vision of unity and hell on earth. This complexity is a very good reflection of what we meet with the borderline personality. So I'm trying to talk about the borderline as a powerful cultural phenomenon. Now, the problem is it's so hard to deal with clinically that there's largely been a regression, at least in America, to rational methods to deal with it, behavioral methods. America is, for most of the time, Kernberg is an outlier. Very few people are able to do that and try to do that as beautiful as I think it is. But most treatment is along models of what's called DBT, dialectical behavior therapy. One gets these people with all these terrible symptoms, and it's hard. You got people who need hospitalizations, who mutilate themselves, who really do self-destructive things. Life's terrible. And so DBT has been a form of behavioral therapy that helps people, often in groups, to lower their acting out, to be able to control self-destructive rage, and they use meditation and a lot of careful techniques to help support so that the catastrophes that go on with the borderline can be minimized. Just how successful it is hard to know. Anecdotally, yes. Statistically, it's all over the map. Although there's some studies that say, yes, it definitely does reduce hospitalizations. But the point is, it's been a regression back to the rational subject-object mode that is choking us in culture and society. And the point is that the borderline has to be reimagined, but from a point of view not of object relations. That's not going to help us. But I think from the wealth of approaches that alchemy provides, we can maybe make a new start. But the main point is that it is really like, Jung said, when God appears in the human psyche, he puts his left foot forward. The borderline is like the left foot of God. The borderline comes into a therapist's practice and chaos is created. But the great issue is, can we work with that chaos and find instead the real new order trying to come up? From my point of view, I'll just tell you ahead, the main treatment issues with the borderline are not only containment and being able to tolerate these affect fields, which from the analyst's point of view require a great deal of faith in a way that God is stronger than the devil. It's a very serious existential crisis. It's often a leap of faith on the part of the analyst. On the one hand, it's tolerating these fields, of tremendous affect fields, but it's within these affect fields. The analyst has to recover the imaginal sight to be able to see, imaginally perceive what's going on in the borderline psyche. This ability to create, get in touch with the imaginal, that the imaginatio in Corban's terms. You mentioned Corban. Corban talks about the process of hima. Hima is a process of throwing projections, so to speak, into the field to enliven the field and enliven imagination. When working with the borderline person, I'll show you in examples, very often one comes through understandings, but they have to be sacrificed in a way, like Corban says, intentionally thrown into the field to enliven the field so that vision can appear. Because it's through vision that the person's self can come alive. That's why the primary myth of the borderline personality is mostly found in Egypt. In Egypt, the god Osiris is a dead god. Now, if we go to Egypt, we go to a mythology that lasted 3,000 years. We go to something essentially powerful, and it is the mythology that was behind the origin of alchemy. But what you get in the incredible Osiris legend, and Osiris was an immanent god, the indwelling god. He was not like Ra, the sky god, the transcendent god. He was this immanent god, and he was continually being killed by the adversary Seth and having to be resurrected. That's the borderline condition. The God within is continually being driven into unconsciousness, into deadness by these terrible attacking affect fields represented by this demon god Seth. What enlivens Osiris? Well, one of the main things, what enlivens him is when the hero Horus battles with the demon Seth, and he brings Osiris his eye. He brings him the eye, and this eye helps resurrect Osiris. That's the whole, for me, a major treatment modality in dealing with the borderline is being able for the analyst to resurrect his own vision, non-ordinary vision, and in that act be able to help enliven the self within the borderline, and within that understanding that any time there is this union state, there's going to be a dark state, a chaotic state to follow. And once again, the loss of sight, the loss of vision, needing to recreate vision, connecting, on and on like that. And it's in these states of union, death, union, nigredo, that this core issue of an impossible fusion begins to transform. But if you can focus, what I'm trying to get at with the main thing is that this awful condition that underlies the borderline, it underlies narcissistic characters in different ways, schizoids in different ways. But in the borderline, it underlies in this very strong, imminent, close feeling of not being able to separate and not being able to stay in any situation. That's why the relationships are so unstable. That's why the person will tend to split into all good, to try to break apart that fusional state. That's why the person has such rage. The classic example of overwhelming rage is in paranoid schizophrenia, where people wonder, why is that rage like it is? It's because the fusion there is so terrible. In the borderline, it's also terrible. In the borderline, you have all of the symptomatology, you see, which can really be understood in terms of desperate attempts to break out of the suffocating level of this an inability to breathe, an inability to separate.